My name is Emily Carter, and for most of my life, I carried the weight of a tragedy that shaped everything I became. When I was 19 years old, I lost my older brother, Daniel, in what everyone called a tragic accident. The story was simple, straightforward, or at least, that's what they told me. A fire broke out in an old warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place Daniel had gone that night for reasons we never fully understood. The flames spread fast, the roof collapsed, and by the time firefighters managed to contain it, there was nothing left but charred rubble. They told us no one could have survived. I remember the funeral vividly, even though I wish I could forget. The casket was closed. There was nothing left to see. My father stood stiff and silent, his grief buried under layers of anger and pride. My mother sobbed uncontrollably, clutching a folded photograph of Daniel when he was just a boy, grinning at the camera with scraped knees and messy hair. And me, I felt hollow. I wanted to cry, to scream, to demand answers. But all I could do was sit there, numb, trying to convince myself that my brother, my best friend, was really gone. Daniel had always been more than just a brother to me. He was my protector, my partner in every childhood adventure, the one person who understood me when the world didn't. He was reckless, yes, but he had a warmth that drew people in. Everyone loved him, teachers, friends, even strangers. To me, he was larger than life. That's why his death felt like the end of my world. It wasn't just losing him, it was losing the sense that life could ever be safe again. After the funeral, the days blurred into weeks, then months. People offered condolences, casseroles, and empty words. He's in a better place. Time heals all wounds. But time didn't heal mine. If anything, it sharpened them. Every time I walked past his empty bedroom, every time I saw his name etched on the tombstone, I felt a jagged pain that refused to dull. I clung to memories, even the painful ones, because they were all I had left. The official report labeled it an accident. Faulty wiring. A spark that ignited old, dry timber. Case closed. But even back then, something in me resisted the simplicity of that explanation. Daniel had no reason to be in that warehouse. He wasn't an electrician, a laborer, or someone with ties to the property. And yet, whenever I asked questions, why was he there? What was he doing? People changed the subject, or gave vague answers. Wrong place, wrong time, they said. I wanted to believe them, but deep down, I couldn't. For years, I tried to bury those doubts. I told myself I was just a grieving sister, desperate for a reason that didn't exist. I focused on school, on work, on anything that could distract me from the gaping hole his absence left in my life. But no matter how hard I tried, Daniel was always there, in dreams, in photographs, in the sound of laughter that sometimes echoed in my memory so vividly it hurt. And so, for a decade, I lived under the shadow of that fire, a sister to a ghost, a woman shaped by loss. I carried guilt too, guilt for surviving, guilt for not asking more questions, guilt for every fight we'd ever had, every word left unsaid. I told myself over and over again that Daniel's story had ended in flames, that nothing could bring him back. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have imagined, was that the fire wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning of a truth I was never meant to uncover. 10 years passed, but the fire still lived inside me like a shadow that refused to fade. I built a life, moved into my own apartment, worked long hours at a marketing firm, and tried to convince everyone, including myself, that I had moved on. Outwardly, I smiled. Inwardly, I carried Daniel everywhere. Some nights I would still wake up drenched in sweat, the smell of smoke vivid in my dreams, as if I had been there in that warehouse with him. People stopped mentioning his name after a while. My parents rarely spoke of him, as though silence was their way of coping. For them, Daniel's death was a closed chapter, sealed and buried. For me, it was an unfinished story, one that refused to let me rest. It was on a rainy Sunday afternoon, while cleaning out boxes in my mother's attic, that everything began to change. My parents had decided to sell the house and downsize, and it fell on me to sift through years of forgotten belongings. Dust clung to my clothes as I dragged cardboard boxes into the light, most filled with the usual clutter: old school projects, holiday decorations, photographs yellowed with age. Then I found it: a shoebox tucked behind heavier boxes of winter coats, labeled in my brother's handwriting: DC. His initials, Daniel Carter. My heart lurched. My mother must have missed it when packing up his things after the fire. I opened the box carefully, almost reverently. Inside were photographs, receipts, scraps of paper covered in Daniel's messy scrawl. Most of it was ordinary: concert tickets, notes he had written to himself. But buried beneath those, folded neatly as though placed there with purpose, was something that made my breath catch. It was a photograph printed on cheap paper, slightly blurred. The date printed in the corner read 2 years after the fire, and there he was, Daniel. He was older, his hair cropped shorter, his face leaner, but it was unmistakably him. His expression was wary, almost guarded, as if he knew he was being watched. He was standing outside a gas station in a neighboring town, one I had driven through countless times. My knees buckled, and I sank onto the floor, clutching the photograph. For 10 years, I had grieved, mourned, and told myself that my brother was gone. But here he was, alive, caught on camera years after I buried an empty coffin. 1,000 questions tore through me. How? Why? If Daniel was alive, why hadn't he come back? Why let us believe he was dead? And who had taken this photo? At the bottom of the box was another clue: a receipt, dated months before the fire, with Daniel's signature scrawled across it. It wasn't from any store in our town. It was from a hardware shop 2 counties over, a place he had no reason to be. Scrawled in the margins were 3 words: "Not safe here." I felt dizzy. It was as though the ground beneath me had shifted, the world tilting into a reality I didn't understand. For hours, I sat there in the attic, staring at the photograph, tracing his face with my fingertips. Every fiber of my being screamed that this wasn't a coincidence. Daniel had faked his death. He hadn't died in that fire. He had walked away from it. And whatever he had been running from all those years ago, it still had power now. By the time I left the attic, my life no longer belonged to me. The questions had taken hold, and I knew there was no turning back. The truth was out there, hidden behind the ashes of a lie, and I would find it, even if it destroyed me. The photograph never left my sight. For days after finding it, I carried it everywhere, tucked into my wallet during work, slipped under my pillow at night, clutched in my hand whenever I needed to remind myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Daniel was alive. The boy I had buried, the brother I had mourned for 10 long years, had been standing outside a gas station 2 years after his supposed death. At first, I tried to tell myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe it wasn't him. Maybe it was just someone who looked like him. An eerie resemblance that tricked my grief into believing a lie. But every time I stared at the photo, every detail screamed otherwise. The curve of his jaw, the scar above his right eyebrow from when he fell off his bike at 12, the way his shoulders sloped. It wasn't just a look-alike. It was Daniel. I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. One evening, I showed the photo to my mother. Her hands shook as she held it, her face going pale. For a moment, I thought she might faint. "Emily, where did you get this?" she whispered. "In the attic," I admitted, "in one of Daniel's old boxes." "Mom, this is him, isn't it?" She looked at the photo for a long time, her lips trembling, then handed it back without meeting my eyes. "It's not him," she said firmly, her voice cracking. "Don't do this to yourself. He's gone. Accept it. But Mom..." She cut me off sharply, her tone almost panicked. "Enough, Emily. I don't want to hear another word." Then she turned and left the room, tears streaming down her face. Her reaction only confirmed what I already knew. She wasn't just in denial, she was hiding something. That night, I sat at my desk with the photo and the receipt from the hardware store, turning them over and over in my hands. The receipt had an address printed on it. I pulled up the location online: an old hardware shop in a small town about 40 miles away. Without thinking twice, I grabbed my keys. The drive was long and silent, the road cutting through stretches of farmland and dark woods. My heart pounded with every mile, torn between fear and anticipation. When I finally pulled up to the shop, it was late, the building dark except for a single flickering light above the door. The windows were dusty, the shelves inside nearly empty. It looked abandoned, but something about it felt alive. I pressed my hand against the glass, peering in. A man behind the counter stirred, lifting his head. Startled, I stepped back as he came to the door. "We're closed," he said flatly. "I'm sorry," I stammered. I found a receipt from here. My brother Daniel Carter, he..." The moment I said Daniel's name, the man's eyes hardened. His hand tightened on the doorframe. "Never heard of him," he said quickly, too quickly. Then he shut the door in my face and flipped the lock. I stood there in the dark, staring at my own reflection in the glass. My pulse thundered. He was lying. He knew something. When I finally turned to leave, that's when I noticed it. Across the street, parked beneath a broken street lamp, was a black SUV. Its windows were tinted, the engine running faintly. At first, I thought it was nothing, just a car waiting for someone. But as I slid into my own car and started the engine, the SUV's headlights flicked on. I pulled out of the lot, so did they. My grip on the steering wheel tightened as I tried to stay calm. I made one turn, then another. Each time, the SUV followed. I pressed harder on the gas, my heart racing. Finally, I swerved into a crowded gas station, pulling up between two trucks. I killed the engine and crouched low in my seat. The SUV slowed as it passed, lingering for a moment before continuing down the road. I sat frozen, barely able to breathe. My brother had faked his death. My mother was hiding the truth. And now, someone was following me. The questions I had once whispered in the dark were no longer just questions. They were a warning, screaming louder with every heartbeat. Daniel hadn't just disappeared. He had been running, and now so was I. The night after the black SUV followed me, I barely slept. Every sound outside my window set me on edge. Every flicker of light across the blinds made my heart race. I sat in bed with Daniel's photograph clutched in my hands, wondering if I had already gone too far. Whoever was watching me clearly didn't want me asking questions. But how could I stop now? For the first time in 10 years, I had proof that my brother's story wasn't over. The next morning, I went back to my parents' house under the pretense of helping them finish packing. But my real reason was the attic. Something told me that shoebox hadn't been the only thing left behind. The air was heavy with dust as I climbed the creaky ladder into the attic again. Sunlight streamed weakly through a small round window, illuminating stacks of boxes. I dug through them methodically. Old yearbooks, Christmas decorations, broken lamps. Then near the back, I found a metal lockbox, tucked beneath a pile of blankets. The key was long gone, but a flathead screwdriver from Dad's toolkit was enough to pry it open. Inside were papers, dozens of them. Some were scribbled notes in Daniel's handwriting, others were receipts, newspaper clippings, even photocopies of what looked like legal documents. I spread them out across the floor, my heart hammering. At first, it looked like random clutter, but the more I read, the more I realized it was a puzzle. One note mentioned Harrison meeting 3 p.m., bring file. Another scribble read, not safe. Watch for tails. There were receipts from motels hours outside our town, each signed in Daniel's handwriting. The dates. They extended into months after the fire. And then, at the very bottom of the stack, was a driver's license. The name printed on it was Michael Grant. But the photo, it was Daniel. Older, thinner, but unmistakably him. My breath caught. My brother hadn't just faked his death. He had built an entirely new identity. I sat back, shaking, trying to process the enormity of what I had uncovered. If Daniel had gone to such lengths, then whatever he was hiding from wasn't small. This wasn't about escaping responsibility or running from family. This was survival. A floorboard creaked beneath me and I froze. For a second, I thought my father had come upstairs. But when I listened, the sound wasn't inside the house. It was outside, on the street. I crept to the attic window and peered down. The black SUV was back, parked 2 houses down, engine idling. Panic surged through me. My fists clenched around the lockbox papers. Whoever these people were, they weren't just watching anymore. They were circling closer, like wolves waiting for the right moment. I stuffed the most important papers into my bag, the license, the notes, the motel receipts, and hurried downstairs. My mother was in the kitchen, humming softly as she packed dishes into a box. She looked up, startled, when she saw my pale face. "Emily, what's wrong?" "Nothing," I lied quickly, forcing a smile. I think I need some air." I bolted before she could press further. My hands trembled as I drove away, the SUV slipping into view in my rearview mirror once again. That evening, I spread Daniel's notes across my apartment floor, piecing them together like fragments of a map. His handwriting grew more frantic with each entry, the paranoia practically bleeding through the ink. Words like surveillance, contact, and threat repeated over and over. One line stood out, scrawled hastily on a torn piece of paper. "If Emily ever finds this, trust no one." The message hit me like a physical blow. Daniel had known. Somehow he had predicted that one day I might stumble upon his trail. And his warning was clear. My brother hadn't just run from an accident. He had been hunted. And now, by following his trail, I had stepped into the same crosshairs. The fire that had haunted me for 10 years no longer felt like a tragedy. It felt like a smokescreen, cover for something darker, something calculated. And as much as fear screamed at me to stop, my resolve hardened. Because if Daniel had left these breadcrumbs for me, then it meant one thing. He wanted me to find him. For the next several days, my life became consumed by the papers I had taken from the lockbox. They covered every surface of my apartment, spread across the dining table, stacked on the couch, pinned to the walls with thumbtacks, like some crime investigator's office. I reread every scribble, every receipt, every date, until my eyes blurred and my head throbbed. The motel receipts became my first real lead. They all pointed to a stretch of highway towns 2 hours away, quiet places forgotten by time, where Daniel could have easily disappeared into the background. The most recent receipt was dated 8 months after his supposed death. He had signed the name Michael Grant, the alias from his driver's license. I stared at the address until it felt burned into my brain. Finally, I decided I couldn't just sit in my apartment staring at paper. I needed to see where he had been. The drive out there was nerve-wracking. Every car that appeared in my rearview mirror made my stomach knot. Every black SUV sent a shiver down my spine. I stopped twice at gas stations, circling the lot before pulling up to the pump, convinced I was being followed. Maybe I was paranoid, or maybe Daniel's warnings were sinking in. The motel was a sad, crumbling place at the edge of a small town. Its neon sign flickered weakly, the letter O in MOTEL completely dark. The air smelled of cigarettes and damp carpet. I walked up to the front desk, my heart pounding. An older woman sat behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. She looked up with tired eyes. "Can I help you?" I slid the receipt across the desk. "I'm looking for someone. He checked in here years ago under the name Michael Grant. Do you remember him?" Her eyes lingered on the paper, then flicked back to me. For a moment, I thought she would shrug it off like the man at the hardware store. But instead, she leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Tall guy, dark hair, always looking over his shoulder?" My pulse raced. "Yes, that's him." "Do you know where he went?" She hesitated, glancing toward the window as if to make sure no one was listening. Then she leaned in closer. "He stayed here a few times. Paid cash, never stayed more than 2 nights. Said he was just passing through, but you don't look over your shoulder like that unless you're running from something. One night, I saw 2 men waiting outside in a car. He slipped out the back and vanished before they realized he was gone." The floor seemed to tilt beneath me. Men waiting in a car. My mind flashed back to the black SUV outside my apartment. "Do you know where he went after that?" I asked desperately. She shook her head. "No idea, but he left something, a package. Said if anyone ever came asking for him, A woman, his sister. This should go to her. She bent down behind the counter and pulled out a small dust-covered envelope. My breath caught as she slid it across the counter to me. My name was written on it in Daniel's handwriting. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Written in Daniel's frantic scrawl were 5 words: "Don't trust them." "Watch the shadows beneath it" was an address in a different town, farther away, and a date, 3 weeks in the future. The date made my stomach twist. Daniel had written this after the fire. He had been alive, planning meetings, expecting someone, me, to one day find him. I looked up at the motel clerk, my voice shaking. "Why didn't you give this to anyone before?" She shrugged, her expression weary. "Because no one ever came. And frankly, I wasn't sure I wanted to be involved. That man, he radiated trouble, and whoever was after him, they were dangerous. I didn't want them turning their attention on me." Her words made my skin crawl. Trouble, dangerous, men waiting outside in cars. I folded the letter carefully, slipping it into my bag. "Thank you," I whispered, though my voice barely came out. As I turned to leave, I caught sight of something in the reflection of the motel's cracked glass door. A black SUV parked across the street. My heart lurched. The same SUV, the same tinted windows, watching, waiting. I hurried to my car, trying to keep my steps steady, my face neutral. But inside, I was unraveling. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was real. They were tracking me, just as they had tracked Daniel. Back in the car, I locked the doors, my hands shaking as I started the engine. My mind screamed at me to drive, to get as far away as possible. But another part of me whispered something else. They wouldn't be following you this closely unless you were close to the truth. As I pulled out of the parking lot, the SUV eased forward too, keeping its distance but never out of sight. Daniel's words echoed in my mind, seared into my thoughts. Don't trust them. Watch the shadows. And in that moment, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't just retracing my brother's steps. I was reliving his nightmare. The letter from the motel never left my side. I must have read Daniel's message 100 times, the words etched into my mind like a scar. Don't trust them. Watch the shadows, and beneath it, that address. A town I barely knew, 3 hours away, scrawled in Daniel's hurried handwriting. The moment I saw it, I knew I had to go. I couldn't ignore it, not after everything I'd uncovered. This was the trail my brother had left, and whether it led to answers or danger, I was already too deep to turn back. I packed a small bag, just the essentials. A change of clothes, a flashlight, my phone, and Daniel's letters and documents, sealed in a folder. Before leaving, I stared around my apartment, half expecting never to see it again. The spray-painted threats on my walls, the eerie silence at night. It didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a trap. The drive to the town was suffocating. Every time headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, I flinched, certain it was the black SUV. I changed lanes often, slowed down suddenly, even pulled off the road once to let cars pass. And yet, just before I reached the town limits, I caught sight of it again. A dark SUV with tinted windows, 2 cars behind me. My chest tightened. They were still there. I pushed harder on the gas, weaving through traffic until I lost sight of them, but my nerves stayed raw. The town itself was small, the kind of place that felt forgotten by the rest of the world. Faded storefronts lined the main street, and the gas station looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1980s. The address led me to a quiet residential area on the edge of town, where the houses sat far apart and the streetlights were few and far between. Number 214. It was a 1-story house, paint peeling from the shutters, the porch sagging. No car in the driveway, no sign of life. For a long time, I just sat in my car, staring at it, my heartbeat thunderous. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but curiosity pulled stronger. I stepped out slowly, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes, sounding unnaturally loud in the still air. My fingers shook as I walked up the porch steps, testing each one. The front door was locked, but when I circled around to the back, I found a small window cracked open. I hesitated. Then, heart hammering, I slid it up and climbed inside. The air was stale, heavy with dust. The living room was almost bare. An old couch, a coffee table, a lamp that looked like it hadn't worked in years. But on the table, beneath a layer of dust, was a single object, a notebook. I picked it up, my hands trembling. Flipping it open, I froze. It was Daniel's handwriting. The entries were short, frantic, sometimes no more than single lines. They found me again. Changed motels, can't stay in one place too long. If Emily ever comes, don't let her trust anyone. And then, one that made my blood run cold. If you're reading this, Emily, it means I couldn't keep running. Don't stay here long. They'll find you too. I dropped the notebook, my breath coming in shallow gasps. My brother had written this for me. He had known, somehow, that I would come looking. Suddenly, a noise shattered the silence. Footsteps, outside. I rushed to the window and peeked through the blinds. A car had pulled up in front of the house. The black SUV. Two men stepped out, both dressed in dark clothes, their movements sharp, purposeful. One of them spoke into a phone, scanning the house. They knew I was here. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the notebook, stuffed it into my bag, and crept toward the back door. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like thunder in my ears. I slipped outside just as one of the men approached the front porch. My car was parked a block away. I sprinted through the yards, crouching behind bushes, my lungs burning. The men's voices echoed faintly behind me, growing closer. By the time I reached my car, I could barely breathe. I dove inside, started the engine, and sped off, gravel spitting under my tires. In the rearview mirror, I saw them running back to the SUV, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. They were chasing me now. I drove for miles, my hands shaking on the wheel, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I didn't stop until I reached a crowded rest stop off the highway. Only then did I allow myself to exhale, though the fear didn't loosen its grip. I pulled the notebook from my bag and read Daniel's words again. Don't trust anyone. They'll find you too. Tears stung my eyes. My brother wasn't just alive. He was in hiding, hunted. And by following his trail, I had just painted the same target on my back. I didn't go home that night. Home no longer felt safe. Not after seeing those men outside the house. Not after realizing how closely they were tracking me. Instead, I drove aimlessly for hours, headlights cutting through the darkness as my thoughts spiraled. The notebook lay open on the passenger seat, Daniel's handwriting illuminated by the dim glow of the dashboard light. Don't trust anyone. They'll find you too. I couldn't get those words out of my head. I wanted to believe there had to be someone I could turn to, someone who would believe me, someone who could help. But who? My parents had shut down the moment I showed my mother the photo, refusing to acknowledge even the possibility. The police? Number. If Daniel's warnings meant anything, then law enforcement might already be compromised. Still, I couldn't do this alone. Not anymore. There was one person I thought I could trust, Mark Jennings. He had been one of Daniel's closest friends back in high school, practically like another brother to us. After Daniel's death, he had stayed in touch, checking in on me now and then, always kind, always steady. If anyone would believe me, it would be him. I called him just after dawn, my voice trembling as I asked if we could meet. He didn't hesitate. Of course, Emily. Where are you? Are you okay? We agreed on a diner outside of town, a quiet place where I felt I could keep an eye on the parking lot. By the time I arrived, exhaustion weighed heavily on me, but adrenaline kept me sharp. I spotted Mark instantly. Tall, broad-shouldered, his face lined with concern as he waved me over. The moment I slid into the booth, he reached across the table, taking my hand. You look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe I have, I whispered. Then I pulled out the photograph, the receipts, the notebook. I told him everything, about the attic, the motel, the letter, the men in the SUV. My words tumbled out in a frantic rush, part confession, part plea. Mark listened intently, his brow furrowed, his jaw clenched. When I finished, he leaned back, exhaling slowly. Emily, he said carefully, What you're describing, it's dangerous. If Daniel really did fake his death, if he's running from people like this, then they won't stop. And if you've been following his trail, you're already in their crosshairs. I know, I said, my voice breaking. But what am I supposed to do? Just walk away? Pretend I didn't find any of this? For a moment, he was silent. Then he leaned forward, his voice low. No. If Daniel's alive, then he must have had a reason to disappear. The only way you'll find the truth is by following the trail. But you need to be careful. Don't go anywhere alone. Don't trust strangers. And Emily? He hesitated. Maybe don't trust family either. If your mom reacted the way you said, she might know more than she's letting on. His words stung, but deep down, I already suspected the same thing. I nodded, grateful for his support. For the first time in days, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight alone. But then something happened that unsettled me. As I left the diner, I glanced back through the window. Mark was still sitting at the booth, but he wasn't looking at the menu or sipping his coffee. He was on his phone, speaking quickly, his back turned slightly as if to shield his conversation from view. I froze on the sidewalk, my stomach knotting. He could have been calling anyone, his wife, his work, but the way he leaned in, the urgency in his posture, reminded me too much of the men I had seen outside the safe house. A chill slid down my spine. Daniel's warning came back to me, sharper than ever. Don't trust anyone. I forced myself to keep walking, to get into my car as if nothing was wrong. But inside, doubt gnawed at me. Had I just made a terrible mistake? Had I handed everything, every scrap of evidence, every lead, into the hands of someone who might already be working against me? That night, alone in my car parked miles from home, I replayed the scene over and over. Mark had always been kind, always loyal. But Daniel's world was different. It was filled with shadows, betrayals, enemies disguised as friends. And now, for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could trust even the people I thought were on my side. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. After meeting with Mark, I drove aimlessly through the night, too afraid to return to my apartment, too paranoid to book a hotel where I might be easily tracked. My only company was the notebook in Daniel's handwriting, resting on the passenger seat like a ghostly reminder that I was following a trail that might consume me entirely. By dawn, exhaustion forced me to pull into a rest stop off the interstate. I parked between two trucks, reclined the seat, and closed my eyes for what I thought would be just a few minutes. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, there was a tap, tap, tap at my window. My eyes flew open. A man stood outside my car, his face obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. He gestured for me to roll down the window. My instincts screamed at me not to. Instead, I reached for my phone, pretending to check a text. When I glanced back up, there was another man, this one on the passenger side. Both wore dark jackets, both scanning the lot with practiced movements. Panic surged through me. Without thinking, I jammed the key into the ignition and started the engine. The men reacted instantly, pulling at the handles of my locked doors. One of them shouted something I couldn't hear, his face twisting in frustration. My tires squealed as I slammed into reverse, narrowly missing the truck behind me, then shot forward out of the lot. In the rearview mirror, I saw them sprint back to a black SUV parked at the edge of the rest stop. My blood went cold. The same SUV, the same hunters. The chase was on. They tailed me onto the highway, their headlights flashing as they closed the gap. My heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. I swerved between lanes, trying to lose them, but they stayed glued to me, relentless. Up ahead, a sign loomed. Next exit, 1 mile. I yanked the wheel sharply, taking the ramp at full speed. My tires screeched as I veered onto a winding country road, trees pressing close on either side. For a moment, I thought I'd shaken them. But then, in the mirror, their headlights appeared again, steady and unyielding. Think, Emily, I muttered to myself, gripping the wheel. What would Daniel do? The answer came in a flash. I spotted a narrow dirt road veering off into the woods. At the last second, I cut the wheel and plunged onto it, branches scraping against the sides of my car. I killed the headlights, heart hammering as I rolled to a stop behind a cluster of trees. Seconds later, the SUV roared past on the main road, its taillights disappearing into the distance. I sat there in the darkness, shaking so violently I could barely hold the steering wheel. My chest burned with each breath, adrenaline coursing through me like fire. For the first time, I understood exactly what Daniel must have felt, living every moment as if it could be his last, hunted like prey. When I finally pulled back onto the road, I didn't head home. I didn't even know where home was anymore. Instead, I drove to a public library in a neighboring town, parked several blocks away, and slipped inside. I needed Wi-Fi. I needed answers. Sitting at one of the computers, I typed Daniel's alias into search engines. Michael Grant. Nothing at first, just a scattering of generic names. But then, buried deep in old news archives, I found something. A brief article about a police raid on an abandoned warehouse. No suspects were named, but the details caught my eye. It had happened in the same county where one of Daniel's motel receipts was dated. Witnesses reported suspicious individuals fleeing the scene before the police arrived. One description matched Daniel almost exactly. Tall, dark-haired, with a scar above his brow. I leaned closer, my pulse quickening. He had been there. He had been part of something. And whatever it had put him on the radar of dangerous people. As I scrolled through more archives, a shadow fell across the screen. I looked up. A man stood at the end of the aisle watching me, not a librarian, not a patron. Just standing there, expression blank, eyes fixed on me. I closed the laptop slowly, my breath shallow. When I stood, he stepped aside politely, as if nothing were wrong. But as I walked toward the exit, I could feel his gaze following me, sharp as a knife. Outside, I glanced around the parking lot. The black SUV was back. And in that instant, I realized something chilling. This wasn't random surveillance anymore. This was an escalation. They weren't just watching me. They were closing in. And unless I found Daniel soon, I wouldn't just be chasing his shadow. I'd be joining it. By the time I left the library parking lot, my nerves were shredded. My hands shook so badly on the steering wheel that I had to pull over twice just to steady myself. The black SUV didn't follow me this time, or at least not openly, but I knew better than to think I was safe. Daniel's words haunted me with every turn I took. Don't trust anyone. Watch the shadows I drove aimlessly for hours, replaying everything I had uncovered so far. The motel clerk, the envelope, the notebook, the men chasing me. Each piece of the puzzle brought me closer to Daniel, but it also painted a darker picture of what he had been involved in. If he had faked his death, it wasn't just to escape family responsibilities or debts. It was bigger. Much bigger. And then I remembered something. Years before the fire, Daniel had a mentor of sorts, a man named Richard Lawson. He wasn't family, but Daniel admired him, called him the guy who knows everyone. I hadn't thought about him in years, but if anyone still had ties to Daniel's world, maybe it was Lawson. I spent the night in my car, hidden in the back corner of a truck stop lot. By morning, I was stiff, exhausted, and desperate. I pulled out my laptop, borrowed the truck stop's free Wi-Fi, and searched his name. It didn't take long to find him, still living in the same city, still listed as the owner of a small auto repair shop. Against all logic, I decided to go. The shop was tucked away in a forgotten part of the city, where warehouses loomed like silent sentinels and graffiti stretched across crumbling walls. The smell of oil and gasoline clung to the air as I pulled up. Inside, the rhythmic clanging of tools echoed, sharp and metallic. Richard Lawson hadn't changed much. His hair was grayer, his shoulders more hunched, but his eyes were the same. Sharp, calculating, always watching. When he looked up and saw me, his brows knitted. "Emily Carter?" he said slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Well, I'll be damned. You're Daniel's little sister." My throat tightened. "I need to talk to you about him." For a moment, something flickered across his face. Hesitation, maybe even fear. He gestured me into his cluttered office at the back of the shop, closing the door behind us. "What's this about?" he asked, his tone guarded. I pulled the photograph from my bag, sliding it across his desk. "This was taken 2 years after the fire. Daniel didn't die, Mr. Lawson. He's alive, and I need to know what he was involved in." Lawson stared at the photo for a long time, his jaw tightening. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, a weary sound. "I told him this would happen," he muttered. "Told him you'd come looking." My pulse raced. "So it's true. He's alive?" Lawson's eyes locked on mine. "Alive, yes, but not safe. And if you're chasing him, neither are you." He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Your brother got mixed up in something he couldn't walk away from. At first, it was small jobs, moving packages, collecting payments. But then he found out too much. About people in suits who smile on TV during the day and make deals with criminals at night. He tried to back out, but by then he was already in too deep." I swallowed hard. "So he faked his death." "To buy himself time," Lawson said, "to disappear before they disappeared him." The room felt like it was spinning. My brother hadn't just run away. He had been forced into exile, trapped in a nightmare that I was now walking straight into. "Do you know where he is now?" I asked, desperation cracking my voice. Lawson hesitated. His fingers tapped the desk, his eyes narrowing. "I shouldn't tell you. The more you know, the more dangerous this gets. Please," I begged. "He's my brother. I need to find him." Lawson sighed heavily, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's a man named Carter Hayes. He used to run with the same people Daniel got tangled up with. If anyone knows where he is, it's Hayes. But be careful. Hayes isn't someone you just walk up to. He's paranoid, armed, and has his own enemies. Approach him wrong, and you won't walk away." He scribbled an address on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. As I tucked the paper into my bag, Lawson fixed me with a stern look. "Emily, listen to me. If you go down this road, there's no turning back. You'll be hunted, same as Daniel. You've already drawn attention. You think those men in the SUV were just joyriding? They're watching, waiting for you to slip." My throat went dry. "Then why help me?" For the first time, his expression softened. "Because Daniel saved my life once. I owe him." "And maybe I owe you too," I nodded, tears burning in my eyes. "Thank you." As I left the shop, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The street was quiet, too quiet. My footsteps echoed off the pavement, the paper with Hayes's address feeling like a burning coal in my pocket. I glanced over my shoulder, and there it was again. The black SUV, parked half a block away, its engine rumbling, its windows dark as midnight. My blood froze. Lawson was right. There was no turning back. The slip of paper with Carter Hayes's address felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in my pocket. Every time I touched it, I felt both closer to Daniel and further from the life I once knew. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I couldn't. Lawson's warning echoed in my ears. "If you go down this road, there's no turning back." The address led me to an industrial part of the city, the kind of place where the air smelled like rust and gasoline, and broken windows stared down from abandoned warehouses like hollow eyes. The building Lawson had marked was a crumbling brick structure with faded paint peeling off its walls. Half the windows were boarded up, and a metal door sat crooked on rusted hinges. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the way on foot, every nerve in my body on edge. My eyes darted from shadow to shadow, scanning for the SUV, for the men who seemed to haunt me at every turn. But this time, the streets were silent. Too silent. I pushed open the heavy door, and it groaned loudly in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint scent of mold. My footsteps echoed against the concrete floor as I called softly, "Carter Hayes?" No answer. I ventured deeper, past stacks of broken pallets and rusting machinery. Then I heard it, a faint shuffle, the sound of someone moving just out of sight. My heart pounded. Emily Carter! A voice rasped from the shadows. I froze. The figure that emerged from the darkness was gaunt, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame, his face pale and hollow. His eyes darted nervously around the room, like a man who hadn't known peace in years. He clutched a pistol loosely in one hand, though he didn't aim it at me. Yet. "You're Daniel's sister," he said flatly. "I can see it in your face." "Yes," I said carefully, raising my hand slightly to show I wasn't a threat. "Please, I need to find him." Hayes let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Find him? You don't find Daniel. You follow the trail he left behind, and if you're lucky, you don't get killed before it ends." "I know he's alive," I pressed. "I've seen proof. I've read his notes. Please, just tell me where he is." Hayes's eyes flicked toward the shadows again, his paranoia palpable. "If I tell you anything, they'll know." "They always know. Who are they?" I demanded, my voice breaking. Before he could answer, a noise shattered the moment, the sound of tires screeching outside, doors slamming, boots pounding against concrete. Hayes's face went pale. "It's too late." Panic exploded in my chest. I turned toward the door, but before I could move, it burst open. The black SUV. 3 men stormed inside, dressed in black, their movements sharp and efficient. Hayes raised his gun, firing wildly, the sound deafening in the cavernous space. One man fell, but the others surged forward. "Run!" Hayes shouted at me, his voice raw. I stumbled backward, heart racing, as chaos erupted around me. Hayes exchanged gunfire with the men, the sound of bullets ricocheting off metal filling the air. I darted toward a side door, Daniel's notebook clutched to my chest like a lifeline. As I shoved the door open, I glanced back just in time to see Hayes collapse, blood blooming across his chest. His last words echoed in my ears. "Find your brother before they do." I sprinted into the alleyway, the cold night air slicing through my lungs. Behind me, footsteps thundered as the men gave chase. My legs burned, my vision blurred, but I kept running, zigzagging through side streets, praying I could lose them. When I finally ducked behind a dumpster in a narrow alley, I pressed my back to the wall, gasping for breath. My whole body shook violently, the metallic taste of fear coating my tongue. Hayes was dead. The men were still after me. And yet, even in the chaos, I had caught a glimpse of something in his office before the attack. A map pinned to the wall, marked with circles and notes in Daniel's handwriting. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew one thing for certain. Hayes had been right. The hunt for my brother wasn't just mine anymore. It was a race, and the enemy was closer than ever.